A study of selected states and cities with data on COVID-19 deaths by race and ethnicity revealed that in the first wave of the pandemic, 34% of deaths were among African Americans. This is distressing because this group only accounts for 12% of the total U.S. population. Families of color continue to face a broad variety of stressors that affect the health and longevity of its members. The roots of this crisis arises from a combination of structural, social, and economic factors. According to the 2015 paper examining racial bias in healthcare, co-authored by distinguished researchers Dr. David Williams and internationally recognized social scientists, this research focused on social influences on health, accompanied by his colleague Dr. Ronald Wyatt, Medical Director, Division of Healthcare Improvement at the Joint Commission. The study found that Black adults have earlier onset of multiple illnesses, greater severity, and more rapid progression of diseases, higher levels of comorbidity and impairment throughout the life course, and higher mortality than whites up to the age of 65 years old. Similar patterns are evident also in American Indians, Pacific Islanders, Asian populations of low socioeconomic status, and U.S.-born Latinos. A recent report by the Kaiser Family Foundation in 2016, examining health and healthcare by race and ethnicity, found that disparities in health and healthcare continue to pose a persistent challenge in the United States. Amongst their findings are the following. Some 41% of non-elderly people living in the United States are non-white. Non-white people face substantial disparities in access to and utilization of healthcare. Black, American Indian, Alaskan Native adults fare worse than whites on most of the measures of health status and outcomes that were examined. Non-elderly Hispanic, Black, American Indian, and Alaskan Native adults remain much more likely than whites to be uninsured despite coverage gains brought about by the Affordable Care Act. According to the Center for Economic and Policy Research, their 2021 report, Black men of prime age, that includes ages 25 to 54, have consistently had the highest annual unemployment rate for the last 20 years. And they estimate that the joblessness crisis for Black men costs families, communities, and our nation about $50 billion annually. Together, these findings set the stage for understanding the factors contributing to higher mortality for Black men due to COVID-19 infection, lower rates of healthcare utilization by men of African ancestry, burdened by the distrust of the U.S. healthcare system, a fragmented approach to addressing the social determinants of health, and lower employment have contributed to a perfect storm for Black men's health. This discussion presents key insights into the biological mechanisms influencing men's health, respiratory disease severity, and the connection between androgen receptor architecture in men of African ancestry and increased susceptibility to diseases, specifically the nexus between the androgen receptor, COVID-19 infection, male-pattern-baldness, and prostate cancer severity. we're going to examine how COVID-19 SARS-CoV-2 infection initiates the Advanced Respiratory Distress Syndrome in men of African ancestry. What we understand about the infection is that you can go from an asymptomatic to symptomatic condition where you have mild and moderate respiratory disease, you have severe disease, you can experience severe alveolar damage, and you can experience pneumonia and respiratory failure, which both of these can be fatal and have been the cause of hundreds of thousands of deaths in the United States. COVID-19 basically infects 4 different cell types in the actual respiratory system. We have ciliated airway epithelial cells. Those cells function to actually help to clear away cellular debris, bacteria, viruses, small particles that you breathed in through your respiratory system. They basically have to clear away a lot of material that could actually cause problems. These cells can become infected. The type 2 pneumocytes are the primary cell types that COVID-19 infects. And this is where most of the larger part of the problem is because these type 2 pneumocytes basically populate the alveolar tissues that are in the part of the lung, the deepest part of the lung, where gaseous exchange occurs to bring oxygenated blood into the actual body, as well as expel carbon dioxide. These cells, unfortunately, are the primary target of COVID-19 infection. The next cells are the pulmonary macrophages. Those cells are involved in the actual immune response and also participate in actually surveying the actual tissues to try to help reduce the impact of infectious organisms. And then last, we have the vascular endothelial cells. Very important cell types because the endothelial cells line all of the blood vessels in the human body. And at the tissue site in the actual lungs, they basically are very vulnerable to actual COVID-19 infection. We have also seen in autopsies that vascular endothelial cells have been basically a site of infection, and we have actually seen hemorrhaging in organs that include the liver, the kidneys, because individuals experienced COVID-19. These endothelial cells were the site of invasion, and the cellular response was these microhemorrhages that actually cut off the blood supply to those organs, contributing to a person's death. Now, what we're going to look at is the androgen pathway for COVID-19 infection. And that all begins with the hormone testosterone. Testosterone is an androgen. It is the male hormone that's responsible for all of the expression of the secondary sex characteristics that make males men. The deep voice, the pattern of hair, beards, the musculature, the aggression, the creativity, as well as vulnerabilities to a variety of other diseases. Now, the testosterone readily diffuses across the cell membrane. Once it comes into the cell cytosol, it's acted upon by 5-alpha reductase. This 5-alpha reductase is an enzyme that converts testosterone to dihydroxytestosterone, DHT. DHT is the most active form of testosterone, and it is responsible for male-pattern baldness. In the scalp of men, particularly men over 50, you find higher amounts of dihydroxytestosterone, and what that does is that actually has an impact on the function of the hair follicles, leading to male pattern baldness. One of the connections between men of African ancestry is that men of African ancestry with male pattern baldness have higher rates of hospitalization due to COVID-19 infection. Not only do men of African ancestry have higher rates of infection, they also have the most severe forms of prostate cancer disease. And this is also due to the impact of dihydroxytestosterone on the androgen receptor. Men of African ancestry have a very unique architecture in their androgen receptors that make them extremely vulnerable to COVID-19 infection. This particular architecture is also implicated in contributing to the severity of prostate cancer disease in African American men, which is more severe and occurs in higher rates than men of other ethnic groups. These actual polymorphisms in the actual androgen receptor are considered to be the primary causative factor for increasing the severity of the disease in men of African ancestry. This androgen receptor also has a transcription factor binding site. That means that this androgen receptor, once it binds dihydroxytestosterone, it is going to actually now dimerize. And when it gets energy from a phosphate bond, it is now going to translocate into the nucleus of the cell. The nucleus of the cell contains the genetic material responsible for gene regulation and gene expression. So the actual androgen receptor now comes in and binds to genes that basically have a promoter for these androgen receptors. Many of these actual genes that have the promoter for the androgen receptor are involved with maleness, are involved with differentiating and turning on the male functions in the body. So now we're going to look at the SARS-CoV-2 infection cycle. Here it is, we have the actual angiotensin converting enzyme. That's a receptor that is expressed in the actual cell membrane. And here it is, we're going to look at the spike glycoprotein. Here we have this S1 subunit and the S2 subunit, and the spike protein is involved with infectivity. So we're looking at number one, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It's going to actually now bind to the actual angiotensin converting enzyme receptor. The actual androgen receptor complex, which is a dimer, which is now a transcription factor, is going to turn on the actual gene expression to now produce an actual enzyme that is involved in the androgen pathway called transmembrane protease series 2. This TMPRSS2 is extremely important because now this enzyme goes to the actual cell membrane and it actually enzymatically cleaves the S2 subunit of the actual COVID spike protein. This is called priming. The next step is membrane fusion. The actual COVID-19 virus will now fuse with the actual cell membrane of the type 2 pneumocyte, and it will now be brought into the cell through a process called endocytosis. And with endocytosis, once the actual virus is in the cell, a sequence of events happens that actually allows the cell to actually use intracellular processes to try to actually combat the presence of this cell. So now we have these lung inflammatory pathways. They're induced by a variety of respiratory viruses. So here it is, we have these genes that are expressed: interleukin 6, JAK, STAT. We also have NF kappa B tumor necrosis factor alpha. And then we have a variety of what's called pro-inflammatory cytokines. And that's interleukin 6, interleukin 10, tumor necrosis factor alpha. These are pro-inflammatory cytokines. And now we are initiating something that is a central mechanism of the pathology called the cytokine storm. And so what we see is the release of these pro-inflammatory cytokines that now bind to other targets in the actual lung tissue, in the actual blood vessels. And now we actually have an amplified situation where this cytokine storm is now driving the actual function of the actual pulmonary tissues into the acute respiratory distress syndrome. The secretion of what's called senescence-associated secretory phenotype, that is quite characteristic that these cells are now in a situation to whereas they're doing everything that they can to fight the viral infection with inside them. And now we're looking at the actual cytokine storm that is now going systemic, that's actually going to be responsible for contributing to the death of the person that's there. This is not just a single cell. These are thousands of cells that are now going through this. Thousands of actual pulmonary macrophages and thousands of type 2 pneumocytes are now into the cytokine storm. They're secreting these senescence-associated secretory phenotype proteins, and now we basically have a crisis on our hands. And if the actual healthcare team can't arrest this expression of the pro-inflammatory cytokines, if they can't arrest the expression of these actual senescence associated secretory proteins, then death is imminent. And this all begins with the actual binding of dihydroxytestosterone to the androgen receptors. And the configuration of the androgen receptors of men of African ancestry is such to where it increases their chances for death and severe disease. During the production of this video, the U.S. has recorded over 930,000 deaths and 78 million cases. The World Health Organization reports 5.8 million deaths and 418 million confirmed cases, with a total of 10.3 billion vaccine doses administered. The U.S. leads the world in confirmed cases by almost double that compared to our nearest competitor, India, at 42 million. Every citizen living in the U.S. must recognize that the structure of the U.S. healthcare system, in terms of cost and effectiveness, is out of alignment. A 2019 research paper published in the January issue of Health Affairs makes the following clear. In spite of all the efforts in the United States to control health spending over the past 25 years, the story remains the same. The U.S. remains the most expensive because the prices the U.S. pays for health services are the most expensive. That's according to lead author Gerald F. Anderson, a professor in the Bloomberg School of Public Health and Health Policy Management. So, what does this mean for people of color who, whenever possible, are paying the highest cost for care anywhere on the planet and getting a demonstrably lower return in terms of quality of life? Advocates for health equity must realize that exposing oneself or their family to COVID-19 is an unavoidable reality, and taking steps to minimize the suffering and loss is the wise choice. Get vaccinated and stay protected always. Other variants are evolving and will present themselves in time. This is the new normal. Adapt and survive.